This is the fifth and final installment of our session on Tzedakah and how we might find ourselves doing something with it today. I've spent most of my time, at least for my part, in this series on the Old Testament. But as we come to the end, I think it's a good idea to look at what followed, which is the so-called intertestamental period. We like to say from Malachi to Matthew. That starts about 200 years before the Common Era and actually extends to about the end of the first century. It's roughly a 300-year period. And there's a lot of stuff that happened in between there. And it's particularly important for our purposes because while, as we have seen, it's hard to say how many aspects of the ancient Israelite social safety net were actually in place before the Babylonian exile, we can say with some certainty that by the time of the intertestamental period, much of that safety net had either disappeared or was simply overwhelmed by the economic forces that pushed thousands and thousands of peasants off their ancestral lands and into basically idle desperation. Outsourcing of skilled work to slave labor had the same effect on independent artisans and other professionals. And Judea had won its independence in the Maccabean revolt, which also takes place during this period. But then they lost it again to the Romans, who took advantage of a civil war to gain control over Judea. Religious institutions were fragmented. There was a great deal of partisanship. They were riven by corruption, cronyism. People, well-intentioned or otherwise, were often working at cross purposes to try to find some way to salvage the situation. This is also a time when we see the development of the Messianic hope, as we see it expressed in the New Testament. Which was, and this often found expression in a number of movements and a few uprisings. So the need for social change and economic reform drove much, perhaps most of the discontent that occasionally flared up into acts of violence or even open revolt. This is not to say that there was no charity, there were no programs for the poor. There were. Even the much maligned Pharisees were actively engaged in collecting and distributing alms to the poor. The intertestamental period is famous for a new genre of religious writing we call apocalyptic literature. These documents were very concerned with the end of the world, a final battle between good and evil, and the hope of a transformed world in which goodness and justice would forever hold the upper hand. They ached for justice, but they tended to favor retribution over restoration. It was not Tzedakah-based justice as we've examined it here. This literature played no small part in setting the stage for Christianity. And they also provided, unfortunately, theological cover for a number of bloody revolts and at least two very disastrous wars against Rome. We don't have time to go into all the long, sordid, bloody history of revolt and revolution and all that went with it. The various uprisings, religious or otherwise, all bore a tedious similarity to one another. They all tended to end the same way, with a dead leader and thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dead followers. If anything, they left the situation consistently worse than it had been before that. Christian scholar Hans Kuhn, in his magnum opus on being a Christian, gave what I think is the best most succinct summary of the spirit of those times. He said, "The world must be changed, positively and radically changed." That was the zeitgeist, the feeling that pretty much everybody agreed on, no matter which side they were actually on. It was, one might say, the perfect time for a Messiah. It was also, unfortunately, a perfect time for reformers, violent revolutionaries, pretenders, and what we would today call terrorists. But out of these efforts to remake the world, there was one that actually worked, or came closest to working. And that, of course, was Christianity. And it was grounded in what we call Tzedakah. Consider also that the brand of Judaism that grew out of the destruction of the Second Temple also outlasted all the other local and regional religious, there really weren't denominations, but religions after the Second Temple, and they too were grounded in Tzedakah justice. The Jesus movement is one of these movements that not only survived the death of its founder, but it went on to transform the Greco-Roman world. This was no small accomplishment. A tiny, rather anti-authoritarian sect managed to eventually outcompete its pagan rivals, displacing religious institutions that had been in place for centuries. We can look at the earliest Christian literature of Christianity, hymns like the Magnificat, or the teachings of John the Baptist, and find an overriding concern for the protection of the vulnerable. I want to look at a very famous passage that describes the back and forth between John and the people he's teaching after he predicts some very serious calamity. And the crowds asked him, "What then should we do?" And he answered them, "Whoever has 2 tunics is to share with him who has none, and whoever has food is to do likewise." Tax collectors also came to be baptized and said to him, "Teacher, what shall we do?" And he said to them, "Collect no more than you are authorized to do." Soldiers also asked him, "And what shall we do?" And he said to them, "Do not extort money from anyone by threats or by false accusations, and be content with your wages." Now, please note, every single one of those recommendations is economic. Not a word about prayer or going to church or offering sacrifice or maintaining ritual purity. John is much like Isaiah in that regard. For him, what matters is the care of the vulnerable. All else is secondary. It would be a bit rash to try to describe the effective nature or summarize the effective nature of the early Christian church, or to speak to how or why it succeeded so well. But if I can summarize the Old Testament in a single tweet like I did in Lecture 1, maybe I can take a stab at this. It won't be tweet-sized, though. Early Christianity not only survived, but outcompeted the Greco-Roman rivals because their ideology of caring for the vulnerable, even those who were not Christian, created communities that were stronger, healthier, more robust, and happier than those of their pagan counterparts. We actually know from extensive studies of funerary markers, epitaphs from this time period, that on average, Christians tended to live longer by comparing the birth and death dates and which gods you worship. You correlate all that together, and Christians live longer. The rise of the Christian communities gives us a first-hand look at the comparative viability between communities that care for the vulnerable and those who do not. And the verdict is unmistakable. A compassionate society is actually stronger than one which neglects those values. Think of it as a proof of concept. I also want to draw attention to another modern-day thinker who is deeply concerned about our society, how our society is facing the environmental crisis. And this is a man named Paul Hawken. He wrote a book in the early 90s called The Ecology of Commerce, which argued that since big business was powerful enough to get us into this mess, only a commerce-based environmentalism had the power to get us out. But a few years ago, he published a second book that represents a complete reversal in his thinking. This book is called Blessed Unrest, and it's subtitled How the Largest Social Movement in History is Restoring Grace, Justice, and Beauty to the World. And he also makes the point that this was a social movement that no one saw coming. Well, what is this social movement? He shows in his book that the greatest agents of change right now is the combined force of thousands and thousands of smaller groups, nonprofit organizations, advocacy groups, local town councils, alliances, religious bodies, indigenous peoples, and so on, which are beginning to have a real impact on matters having to do with the environment. Hawken also acknowledges, in a way that he didn't before, the clear link between economic inequality and environmental degradation. My point in bringing this up is to point out that even if we can't change the whole world, we can at least try to change our little corner of it. And when we do, however, we still participate in something much larger. One of the most important ways to make those changes is to share our stories. Now, last time I made a kind of impromptu reference to my own story of a 6-year span of chronic unemployment or underemployment, and to be honest, I was sugarcoating it. A lot, actually. What is needed in Corvallis is a real safety net. Telling our stories is part of that, and I know Missy has more to say about that, or she will. Those people who lead our community, who have the power to actually make the changes that are needed, they need to hear these stories. They need to hear from us as part of our efforts to put measures in place to aid those who need help. So what happened? In my case, between a layoff in 2009 and finally gaining full-time employment in 2015, we lost our health insurance twice. We were priced out of our rental and had to move twice. Our car broke down and had to be replaced. I was forced into Chapter 7 bankruptcy. I contracted pancreatitis twice and was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, among other things. I could go on, believe me, but I won't. All the while, Denise and I did what we could to bring in money, which was never enough in that high-priced economy in the San Francisco Bay Area. For my part, I did a huge range of different things, but they were always one-time gigs. There was almost never anything that turned into something regular. I will speak to one particular instance that was especially instructive for me, and that was my second bout of pancreatitis. The first one, I didn't have health insurance, and so I had to ride it out on the living room couch and lost 23 pounds in 9 days. But the second one, I was driving home from doing some yard work for a friend, and I started feeling this pain in my chest, thinking, oh crap, here we go. And so I go to the emergency room, and they said, okay, it's not your heart, good news, bad news, it's your pancreas, we're admitting you. So for those of you who haven't experienced it, pancreatitis is recognized as being one of the most painful conditions known to medicine. I mean, it hurts. It feels like someone's working over your torso with a ball-peen hammer. It's awful. So I'm sitting in this wheelchair while they wheel me in. They've given me a shot of morphine, but they told me, but I could hardly tell. I mean, I figured, okay, I might be able to sleep, but it still hurts like crazy. They finally get me in the bed. I'm stuck full of needles. I've got electrodes all over me. I'm looking forward to at least 2 days of a clear liquid diet, and that's when it hits me. As long as I'm here in this hospital, nobody in their right mind could expect me to look for a job. This is great! And that's when I realized the qualitative difference between between physical pain and mental anguish. And so, if you are in a position of extreme poverty or extended joblessness, you are always looking for a job. You are always trying to find something. You are always trying to make something happen. And that's the anguish. That's your world. And it wears on you. It wears you down. It wrecks your mind. And that was, I'll almost say it was worth the pancreatitis to get that insight. Sometimes knowledge comes through pain. And I guess this was one of them. So what got us through? What got us through this thing? Well, one major factor that helped us survive was the Episcopal church we attended, which was located in Portola Valley. We began attending before my layoff. Denise had expressed some interest in singing in a choir, and a friend had invited us to sing in their church choir. You could say that we came for the choir and stayed for the church. We found a parish that was filled with compassionate, intelligent people, and when it all started to come apart, they helped us as they could, as best they could. And when we needed it, and had it not been for them, I shudder to think how it might have ended up. So that's my story, or part of it. As I wrap up this lecture and my part in this series, I reflect on how I can distill this down to its essence, everything that we've been through, over the last 5 weeks. What are the takeaways? Well, I'll leave you with 2 points. First, the Old Testament legislation and the experience of early Christianity gives us a strong theological and practical basis for moving boldly in the direction of a Tzedakah-based framework for helping the vulnerable in our community. And the second takeaway point is the world must be changed, positively and radically changed. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for having me here again. It's bittersweet to be here because I've so enjoyed all of the energy that we've created in this room over the last 5 weeks, and I think it's really going to lead to some really incredible and amazing things. So I want to start by with my most favorite quote in the entire world: "Do one thing every day that scares you." I actually have Eleanor Roosevelt's signature tattooed on my arm. To remind me, it's right here, to remind me why I do the work that I do. And I was told very early on in my career, in about 2007, because I didn't pass comprehensive sex education legislation in Utah, that I was the most, by a board member I was told this, but I was the most ineffective lobbyist. And if I had been the lobbyist for the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks would have died on the back of the bus. And at that time, I had to call real deep on my courage and say, whew, okay. And I love Eleanor Roosevelt, and so I thought, what would Eleanor do? And I walked straight down to the tattoo parlor and tattooed her signature on my arm to remind me of her strength and her wisdom in times when you are being she has a great quote about standing up and being shot at, verbally and literally, and that we have to do that. And so, in this, in particular, when we are talking about people in poverty and talking about caring for our community as a whole, I believe that doing one thing every day that scares us is a really nice space to come from advocacy in. And so, that is sort of where I engage in my social justice advocacy space. And so I wanted to share that with y'all because every day I do something that scares me and makes me feel very nervous. And actually this was one of those things. So I have provided everyone with a handout that's got an advocacy script. So I gave you these to take home with you so you could have them with you forever. But I have found that sometimes it's really helpful to have a script in front of you when you're sending an email or writing to an elected official. And I'm going to give some suggestions of some real tangible things that we can write to our elected officials about. And I'm not just talking our federal elected officials, I'm talking about our elected officials at the city, county, and state level, in particular the city and county level here in our community, because I believe we have an opportunity to engage in some very powerful dialogue and conversations with them based on everything that we've learned and seen over the last 4 weeks, especially from a space of Christianity. I feel like it's time to sort of put our politeness aside. I was raised by a very political grandmother. We were very involved in the League of Women Voters and the Junior League and all those things. And my grandma, my aunt really instilled in me that you talk about politics, but we wouldn't talk about politics at dinner. We wouldn't talk about money at dinner. And, you don't talk about those things. It's very rude. And I've just decided in 2018 that Emily Post be damned, because I had to read that book like 3 times, but as a child. And I know where my forks go, and I know where my meat goes, and I know how to cook and clean and do all those fabulous things, but I'm telling you, I'm done with being polite in 2018. And there's a place for manners, but I think that there has to be some moment where we put our politeness aside and tell our stories of hardship, and tell the vulnerable stories that people don't want to talk about because they have to do with money or politics. And so I think you can keep these emails or letters to your elected officials very short and sweet. And all of their information is online and it's public record. And so in the first paragraph, when you're really talking about why it hits home for you, you want to just do 2 to 3 very succinct, simple bullet points about why this is your experience and your story. And then in the next paragraph, you talk about how it's personally impacted you, your family, and your community. When you were talking about having that man sleep in your backyard last week, that just was such a profound story. My husband, Jim, and I have both experienced homelessness as teenagers. We used to have a young man who slept in his car outside of our house, and every morning he would come in and I would make him breakfast and he would take a shower and then he would leave again. And he did that for months. And I think we all have these experiences and these stories where we have, at one point or another, whether it's our family or our friends or a total stranger, engaged in that sort of action. And I think that telling our elected officials is really, we're at a critical point. And it's very important to write the words, that's why I want you to vote yes or no on this issue. And be very explicit about the yes or no piece. And this is why I want you to do this, because it directly impacts me as your constituent. And the one thing I will say is, in the subject line on an email, even when you're writing a personal letter to an elected official, you want to put I am your constituent in the subject line. So even if it's on an envelope, you put I am your constituent. Well, they'll know from your return address, but still, it's important to be explicit that as your constituent, I am writing you this email, because they get thousands, especially if it's during a legislative session or some big heated thing is coming up at city council or county council, that they're getting inundated with emails, that it's really important to say I'm your constituent, because they will sort their emails based on that subject line.
Some of them won't accept your email.
No, if you're not a constituent, yes. And so it's a really critical piece to engaging in advocacy on this level. So there are a couple of things that I think have really come out of our conversations here that Sheldon and I really want to highlight as potential opportunities for us to move together as not just a congregational community, but members of the community as a whole. And the first one is to see if by some amazing, great advocacy work, we could get the Homeless Bill of Rights either passed at a city or a county level. The state refuses to do it for a number of reasons. But I think there's another opportunity for us to impact it at a statewide level. But there is a way to have a conversation about at least several pieces of the Homeless Bill of Rights that directly impact the homeless people that we're seeing here in our community. This morning I had the deep pleasure of meeting with a woman who, on her own, because of what she was seeing for the last 3 months, she started an organization personally called Socks That Rock. and she just started collecting socks and underwear for the homeless around town. And she had mentioned it to me. She's a server at the Broken Yoke, and she had randomly mentioned it to me one time when I was in for brunch. And what ended up coming out of that conversation was me really helping her develop her strategy for how she's going to move forward to continue to do this, to fill the gap of making sure that people have clean underwear and clean socks while they're living on the street. And she told me about all the barriers she'd been running up against with the fact that she's not a registered nonprofit, and how do we make that happen, and the fact that she's not made of money, and how do we help her get funding, and how she's networking with all of the right people, the right stakeholders, the right organizations in the community, but she's also getting a lot of pushback. And we talked about some strategies for how she could be very visible to really make this happen. But when I mentioned the Homeless Bill of Rights, you know, she's a server. She has her food handler's permit. She has all of the technical things in place for her to serve food. But when she was just blown away that you can't eat and exchange food in public. And there's that little shop over by Broken Yoke that does pay it forward lunches, the little lunch place over there. And so you can buy your lunch and then do a pay it forward lunch for the next homeless person that comes up, and they do a Thanksgiving meal out of there every year. But they had thought about expanding it and doing it somewhere else, but then you have to have all the permits and all those things in place. And so we talked about how just, you know, Panera getting rid of its old bread. They can't necessarily do that without going through a food bank or some other source, and there's lots of reasons for that. But I also think that this is a really important conversation to have, if this is something that we find to be really important. The other thing I think would just be really incredible, would, for some of us in this room, as a group, would be to get together and figure out how to make homeless storage units happen. And I just think that this is such a remarkable way we could get grant funding or raise some money from some major donors, or figure out a way to work together with other faith and advocacy organizations and maybe even the university to figure out how to get a couple of these containers and put them in various church parking lots so that homeless people have places to store their stuff that's safe and is in a couple of different places around the city, and would give them the opportunity to also work. So the critical piece to this for me is that if we're going to place the units throughout the city using church parking lots or other places of faith, that we develop a plan for continuous volunteer and financial opportunities for homeless people. So they are in charge of maintaining and cleaning and distributing. They catalog what's coming into the storage unit. They can catalog what's going out of the storage unit. They keep a log. They learn some skills. You know, they get paid some sort of stipend so that they have that investment in the storage unit. So it's not just ours given to them, but it's theirs. And it becomes that safe space where they can put their things in and go to their doctor's appointments. And they don't have to worry about where they're going to put their shopping cart. And so I think doing this in a way that helps us also develop their skills to work and gives them money so that they can feed themselves and get their meds and all that good stuff, I think is a really cool opportunity. I love this. Like, I was just like, this is the greatest idea ever. So other people really think it's a good idea around here too. Another thing I think would be really incredible would be to do some ordinance advocacy, and a lot of folks in this room have talked about their knowledge of different ordinances throughout, you know, that directly impact people in poverty and housing and homelessness here in Corvallis. And I think it would be great if we had some sort of committee of faith leaders and people from the community, advocates, who could get together as a group to lobby city and county officials realistically and advocate to address the drastic shortage of affordable housing here in Corvallis. Really, really advocate for that and figure out a strategic plan to help the city and county council understand the deep complexities of this issue in a way that talks about how we move forward as a community. I think partnering with the Community Alliance of Tenants to create advocacy opportunities in Corvallis would be a phenomenal way to address tenants' rights issues. They have the platform and the materials and all of the things. You don't have to recreate the wheel, you just have to make sure that we have someone here in the community that's a touch point for them. And they've expanded into other rural areas with some really great success, and I think they just are a really nonprofit organization that would fit well here in Corvallis. And then compiling a list of relevant city and county ordinances that could be impacted by our advocacy efforts so that we sort of have an ongoing knowledge base of what is critical, of the policies that are important, and then so we can check them off as we, work to improve them and fix them and make them better to directly impact the people here in Corvallis, I think would be really cool. And then the sort of radical person in me really wants to get super guerrilla here. I don't know if you're familiar with the Religious Freedom Act of 1993, but it ensures that interests in religious freedom are tolerated. And I really want to flip the script for why that thing was passed in the first place. Because religious freedom, to me, is about tolerance and unity, not discrimination. And it is our religious beliefs that allow us to have people pitch a tent in our yard, or provide rooms for people with no shelter, or to feed the hungry when we darn well please. And I think that if we have to go up against some of these ordinances because they aren't changed, that we can do it because we are Christians. And we can do it because we are religious. And we can, so when the county comes and says, you can't have that person sleeping on your land, we can just say, actually I'm exercising my religious freedom and I'm making that happen as a religious person, because if I don't, it violates my Christian faith, and you can't stop me. We can actually use the policies that have been put in place to discriminate, to protect religion, and flip the script. And when Sheldon and I were talking about this the other day, I was like, oh, that's so good! Because the Department of Health and Human Services just invoked this big special office that allows doctors to discriminate if they consciously object as conscientious objectors. And I think that we should be conscientiously objecting to the lack of housing in Oregon in a way that is actually full-on protected by the Constitution and by all of the laws in place. So that's like my little guerrilla, sassy, the thing I really want to do, try and get that tent off my property. I really want to close with these things. Run for office or get somebody else to run for office. When I was talking to Jessica this morning, I looked at her and she's like, I just don't know what to do. And I was like, you're going to run for council. And she's like, what? And I was like, you're going to run for office. And she sat there for me and she goes, I'm going to run for office. And I go, You're going to run for office. And she was like, I'm going to run for office. And I was like, yes, you're going to run for office. And she was like, I could actually run for office. When you ask a woman to run, she runs. It takes about 5 or 6 times, but she runs eventually. When you ask a man to run, he just runs for office. So women need to hear it a couple times. So this is my way of getting parity on the city council. Okay, so we need to vote in every single election as if our lives depended on it, because they do. I really want to put politeness aside and talk about politics and money all the time. And then I'm so deeply grateful for this opportunity to be a part of this congregation and to be a part of this community. And I really want us to remember that what sustains us in our life is love. And I was listening to Father Simon in church on Sunday talking about love.
I'm having trouble understanding.
And
no, the speaker was
it really hit me.
amplified.
What Sheldon and I have managed to do here is we have developed a roadmap based in theology to address the safety net. We have actually created a map that can be used throughout the entire world to address the safety net. And what's really remarkable to me that I wasn't expecting at all is that we have engaged in the miracle of translation, literal translation, biblical translation, to create human purpose. And I never expected, I thought Sheldon would do his thing and I would do my thing, and somehow they'd come together, because we really never talked about our presentations. And somehow we've translated this all into a purpose, and it's remarkable. And so I really believe that we can carry this forward in a way that is tangible and allows us, and that's why Sheldon has the sign-up sheet that's sort of hit a roadblock there. But if you really are interested in carrying this conversation forward and please throw your name on there, and we might have your information, and if we don't, we don't. And if you're too busy, it's okay, like no pressure. But I really hope that we can continue this conversation. I know that creating some sort of, it would be wonderful to create some sort of rolling jubilee. Like, it would be amazing if we could actually figure out how to make that happen in 2018 for real and recreate that in a way that actually helps people here in the community. I think it would just be remarkable. So I leave you with the good old pioneer ethic of taking care of each other, because that's how I was raised. This particular congregation, from all of my experiences, is committed to seeing the best come to this community. And it is my hope and my wish that we are able to continue this momentum to do the same thing. And for any of you that are also interested in really, and I'm speaking to the women here in the room, but I am actually doing another workshop here at the church on April 28th. As it's a workshop that I do all around the country. So like, I'm going to Massachusetts next week, and I do them all around the country, and I'm doing one here at the church. So if anyone else is interested in continuing this conversation and really getting into your advocacy for the women in the room, that's one of the things that I'm going to be doing in April. So I hope we can continue this conversation and really make this into something that's really glorious. So thank you for everything. It's been wonderful to be here.